In the frontier town of Dry Creek, judgment traveled faster than the wind. It clung to women like dust on a hemline, impossible to shake once it settled. Eliza May Carter had learned that truth the hard way. She stood at the back of the small wooden church, her gloved hands folded so tightly her fingers ached. Sunlight slipped through the warped windows, catching the motes of dust that hovered like unspoken accusations. At the front sat the town elders, 3 men who believed they spoke for God, law, and tradition all at once. They were farmers and cattlemen, not ministers, but in Dry Creek, survival gave men authority whether they deserved it or not. Eliza was 26, a widow for nearly 2 years, and worst of all, in their eyes, childless. On the frontier, children were not just blessings. They were labor, legacy, proof that a family would endure another winter. A woman who bore no children was whispered about, pitied at first, then blamed. After 7 years of marriage and no baby to show for it, Eliza had quietly become a problem the town wanted solved. The land belongs to families, Elder Finch said, clearing his throat. And a widow without heirs has no rightful claim. Eliza wanted to argue. She wanted to remind them that she had worked that land beside her husband, that her hands had bled in the same fields. That grief did not make her less human. But she had learned that a woman's voice carried little weight once a verdict had already been decided. Around her, townsfolk avoided her eyes. Some felt shame. Others felt relief that the scrutiny wasn't on them. At least not today. Her barrenness had been discussed in hushed tones for years. The traveling doctor once said her body showed no signs of sickness, only mystery. But mystery frightened people. It was easier to call it punishment. By sundown, they told her she was to be gone. No sermon followed. No prayer, just the scrape of chairs and the shuffle of boots as the meeting ended. Eliza stepped outside into the glaring afternoon light, her chest tight but her spine straight. Crying would come later. Not here. Not in front of them. She walked home slowly, past the general store where women once smiled at her, past the well where she used to draw water alongside laughing mothers. Her small house stood at the edge of town, already half claimed by silence. Inside, she packed only what she could carry: clothes, a Bible with loose pages, her mother's shawl. When she finished, Eliza sat on the edge of the bed that still smelled faintly of her husband's soap. She rested a hand on her belly, flat beneath her dress, the same place she had touched in hope and prayer for years. "They think they know," she whispered, voice barely sound at all. "They think life answers to their rules." Outside, the wind kicked up, rattling the windows as if the land itself was listening. Eliza stood, slung her bundle over her shoulder, and stepped out of the house without looking back. At the last fence post, the boundary between judgment and unknown freedom, she paused. Once more, she placed her hand over her belly. Her heart pounded with fear, yes, but also with something new. Defiance. "They'll regret losing you," she murmured. Then she crossed into the open plains. Historically, frontier towns often relied on rigid social and religious interpretations to maintain order in unstable environments. With limited medical knowledge, infertility was frequently misunderstood and unfairly blamed on women. Eliza's exile reflects a painful truth of the American West. Survival demanded strength. But compassion did not always survive alongside it. As Dry Creek shrank behind her, Eliza did not yet know what waited ahead. But for the first time, her future was not being decided by men who feared what they could not explain. It was being written by her own 2 feet, moving west one determined step at a time. The land beyond. Dry Creek stretched wide and merciless, a rolling expanse of sunburned grass and scattered mesquite that offered no welcome to the unprepared. Eliza May Carter felt its weight the moment she crossed the last fence post. There were no more church bells here, no eyes measuring her worth. Only sky, wind, and the long road west, The first night alone was the hardest. Eliza camped beside a shallow draw, pulling her mother's shawl tight as the temperature dropped. Coyotes sang somewhere in the distance, their cries sharp and lonesome. Fear pressed in on her chest, but she forced herself to breathe slowly, the way her husband once taught her during a prairie storm. Panic, she knew, wasted strength, and strength was survival. By morning, she rose with stiff limbs and blistered feet, but also with a quiet resolve. She followed wagon ruts left by settlers chasing better land, better luck, better versions of themselves. Every mile placed more distance between her and the voices that had defined her by what she lacked. Work came where it always had on the frontier, hard and uncertain. At a small ranch, she washed clothes in iron kettles until her arms trembled. At a freight stop, she cooked beans and salt pork for teamsters who barely noticed her beyond the meals she served. She learned quickly which men were kind, which were careless, and which were dangerous. A woman alone had to read people the way others read weather. Weeks passed. Summer deepened. Eliza noticed changes she tried not to name. Her appetite grew strange salt one day, sweetness the next. Mornings left her dizzy, the horizon tilting beneath her feet. She told herself it was exhaustion, the heat, the miles she walked with too little rest. Hope was a fragile thing, and she had learned the cost of believing too soon. Still, at night, when the world grew quiet, her hand drifted to her belly on its own. She remembered the doctor from years earlier, a tired man with sad eyes who carried more doubts than answers. Some women just take longer, he had said, and some mysteries aren't ours to solve. On the frontier, medicine lagged far behind faith and rumor. Without understanding, people reached for blame. One evening, while helping mend fence at a cattle camp, Eliza grew faint and nearly fell. A ranch cook caught her arm, concern flashing across his face. "You best sit," he said. "You ain't sick you're expecting." The words struck like thunder. Eliza sat on a low stump, the world rushing in and out. Expecting. After all those years, after being cast out, tears burned her eyes, not from sorrow, but from something close to awe. Life had come when she had nothing left to lose. Fear followed close behind. What if others found out? What if this truth brought only more judgment? A pregnant woman without a husband was no safer than a barren widow in the eyes of many towns. Eliza thanked the cook and kept her secret, choosing silence over celebration. As her body changed, so did her spirit. She moved with purpose now, guarding the life she carried. She took care where she stepped, rested when she could, and trusted her instincts more than ever before. For the first time, she was no longer surviving for herself alone. The land seemed to soften toward her, not kinder but honest. Storms came and went. Heat scorched, then relented. She learned to read the sky, to ration water, to ask for help when needed. Frontier life, she discovered, rewarded humility and punished pride. By early autumn, Eliza arrived at a remote cattle ranch tucked between low hills. The man who owned it, Thomas Hawley, looked her over once, not as a judge, but as someone measuring character. "You work?" he asked. "Yes," Eliza said steadily. "You stay honest?" "Always." "Then you can stay." No questions about her past. No demands for explanations. Just work, shelter, and a chance to earn her keep. For Eliza, it felt like mercy disguised as practicality. That night, as she lay beneath a roof for the first time in weeks, she placed both hands over her belly. The child within her was real, now undeniable proof that the town of Dry Creek had been wrong. "They cast us out too soon," she whispered. "But we'll be all right." Historically, many women on the American frontier survived through adaptability rather than protection. With limited legal rights and medical understanding, they relied on resilience, skill, and intuition. Eliza's journey reflects the quiet strength, required of women whose lives unfolded far from the safety of settled places. Outside, the wind moved through the grass like a promise. Eliza May Carter had never imagined that a man could treat a woman as more than a servant, a burden, or a rumor. But Thomas Hawley was not like the men in Dry Creek. His ranch lay nestled in a shallow valley, shielded by low hills that caught the wind and offered privacy from wandering eyes. The main house was weathered but solid, with wide porches and a roof that had withstood decades of sun, rain, and the occasional prairie storm. Thomas himself was a man carved from the land broad-shouldered, with hands calloused from decades of tending cattle and repairing fences. His hair was streaked with silver, his eyes sharp and observant. He had been widowed once, and in the quiet of the West, he understood loss not as a weakness, but as a quiet, persistent teacher. When Eliza arrived, she was weary from travel, but she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had survived exile. Thomas looked her over for a long moment, neither suspicious nor lecherous, but appraising the kind of character he could trust with his livelihood. "You work?" he asked, the single word more of a statement than a question. "Yes, sir," she replied, steady and unwavering. "You tell the truth?" He asked next. "Always?" she said, remembering the lies that had marked her as unworthy in Dry Creek. Thomas nodded and gestured to the barn. "Then you can start tomorrow." It wasn't much a roof over her head, work that would tire her muscles but not her spirit, but it was enough. For the first time, Eliza felt that her life might belong to her, not to the judgment of strangers. Days turned into weeks, and Elisa settled into the rhythm of ranch life. She learned to mend fences, tend to the cattle, and ride through the open plains without fear of falling or getting lost. Each skill strengthened her confidence. She realized that the frontier did not reward titles or lineage, it rewarded perseverance, intelligence, and the courage to keep going when the wind blew hardest. Meanwhile, subtle changes in her body reminded her of the fragile hope growing within. Her belly, once flat and scorned, now hinted at life. She confided in no one, fearing that a pregnancy without a husband might again mark her as scandalous. Yet Thomas noticed the small signs, the way she sometimes grew pale during the afternoon sun, the mornings she lingered by the water trough instead of riding out to check cattle. One evening, after the sun had dipped behind the hills and the sky was painted in streaks of pink and gold, Thomas found her sitting on the porch steps, her hands cradling her abdomen. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he sat beside her, letting the wind carry the sounds of the plains between them. Finally, he said quietly, "You're carrying life." Eliza's eyes widened, and she looked down as if the child inside her might vanish if she acknowledged it too loudly. Fear, joy, and disbelief swirled together. She nodded faintly, then whispered, "I've been afraid I'd be cast out again." Thomas placed a rough hand over hers, a gesture of solidarity, not dominance. "A woman ain't broken just because others say so. This is life, and it's yours." For the first time in years, Eliza felt seen, not as a failure, not as a widow, not as someone to be pitied, but as a woman with strength, purpose, and a future she could shape. Her secret life growing within her would no longer be a source of shame, but of hope. Working on Thomas's ranch also brought small lessons of the West that history books often overlook: how survival required skill over lineage, how intuition and adaptability could save a life, and how the hardest labor often revealed the most resilient people. Eliza discovered that strength was learned, honed like the edge of a knife, and that independence did not mean isolation. It meant making choices that allowed life to flourish, even against the odds. As autumn turned the plains golden and the first frost dusted the hills, Eliza felt a growing sense of purpose. She could not undo the pain of Dry Creek, but she could claim her life on her own terms. And as she rested her hands over her belly that night, she whispered once more to the child within, "They will see one day. They'll know we survived. We will be all right." Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly, wild and unforgiving, but also generous to those brave enough to endure. Eliza had stepped into freedom, and for the first time, she understood that exile had not been the end, but the beginning of something larger than fear. The first whisper reached Eliza on a crisp autumn morning, carried by the wind across the rolling hills. A rider, dusty and hurried, approached Thomas Hale's ranch, his horse kicking up clods of dry earth. His eyes, wide with a mix of surprise and unease, locked on the small figure on the porch. Eliza recognized him immediately, a man from Dry Creek. Sent with messages, rumors, and accusations. It seemed that no matter how far she traveled, her past had a way of catching up. News of her pregnancy had traveled faster than she could imagine. By the time the rider dismounted and removed his hat, the weight of the town's judgment pressed upon her once again, as if carried in his anxious gaze. We heard about your condition," he stammered, avoiding her eyes. "The elders. They want to speak with you." Eliza rose, steady and unflinching. She had feared this moment, yes, but she had spent months learning the strength of her own voice. The town had cast her aside for being barren, for not fulfilling their narrow definition of a woman's worth. Now, with life growing inside her, she would not bow to fear. "Tell them," she said calmly, her voice carrying the firmness of the plains themselves, "that I am no longer their concern." The rider hesitated, clearly unsure how to respond. Behind her, Thomas Hale's presence offered quiet reassurance. He did not speak, but his hand rested lightly on hers, a reminder that she was no longer alone in the world. And that strength was not weakness when shared. Despite her resolve, curiosity and defiance mingled within her. When the delegation arrived a week later, she met them on the ranch porch. Elder Finch and 2 other men from Dry Creek approached, their boots crunching on gravel, eyes darting nervously. They had expected to see a broken, humbled woman, ready to beg forgiveness or retreat in shame. Instead, they saw Eliza May Carter standing tall, hands resting confidently on her hips, her rounded belly undeniable proof of her life and resilience. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice calm but unwavering. Elder Finch cleared his throat, shuffling papers that carried more authority than wisdom. We heard you are with child. It is unexpected." Eliza allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. "It was unexpected for you, perhaps," she replied, "but not for me. Life has its own course, and I have survived when others doubted I could." The men shifted uncomfortably. She could see the shame prickling beneath their faces, the discomfort of having judged without knowledge, of believing faith alone could dictate human worth. In her eyes there were no longer elders commanding respect. They were fallible humans, confronted by the consequences of their own rigid beliefs. "Your town cast me out for being barren," she continued, her voice stronger now. "You called me a burden, a failure. You claimed to know what was best, yet you left me with nothing but exile and scorn. And now you come here?" Elder Finch faltered, unable to speak. His companions looked away, muttering excuses that sounded hollow even to themselves. "I have no need for their approval," Eliza said quietly, resting a hand on her belly. "I will not return as a penitent. I will not let their judgment define my worth or the life I carry." Thomas Hollis stepped forward, placing a protective hand at the small of her back. "She's under my roof and she's under my care," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And I stand by her. What you think matters little here. The elders, Now confronted by the undeniable proof of life and the presence of a man who respected her for her character rather than her reproductive status, had no choice but to retreat. Humility, though rarely taught, had arrived in the form of quiet truth. That night, Eliza walked the ridge overlooking the ranch, the sky ablaze with stars stretching endlessly across the west. She pressed her hand to her belly and whispered softly, not to the wind this time, but to the child within. They will see us. They will know we survived. And they will learn that strength comes from within, not from the approval of others. Historically, frontier women faced similar scrutiny and judgment. Communities often enforced social norms harshly, while limited medical understanding created fear around infertility and pregnancy. Eliza's story reflects not only the resilience required to survive the physical hardships of the West, but also the moral courage needed to reject unjust social expectations. As the prairie night settled around her, she realized that exile had not been the end of her story, it had been the beginning of a life she would claim on her own terms. A life defined by truth, perseverance, and the unshakable bond between a mother and her child. The morning sun spilled gold across the hills surrounding Thomas Hale's ranch. Eliza May Carter stood on the porch, hands pressed over the swell of her belly, the cool autumn wind teasing strands of hair across her face. In the distance, the town of Dry Creek lay silent, its judgment and gossip no longer able to touch her. For the first time, she understood that redemption was not given, it was claimed. Step by step, with every choice made in courage and truth. She had not returned to confront Dry Creek out of revenge. That had been a temptation, she admitted, as she tied her shawl tight before checking the cattle. But revenge leaves a bitterness that festers longer than any insult. Instead, she had come to show them that their cruelty had not defined her life. She had grown stronger, wiser, and more capable than they could have imagined. The delegation from Dry Creek had departed days earlier, muttering apologies and excuses that carried no weight. Elder Finch, who once wielded authority like a weapon, avoided her eyes entirely, realizing too late that his town had misjudged the woman who carried life where he saw only emptiness. Their whispers could no longer reach her. The West had a way of teaching humility not through sermons, but through proof, and Eliza had provided it. Thomas Hawley joined her, carrying a tin cup of coffee. His eyes softened as he studied her, noticing the quiet glow of confidence she radiated. "You've done well," he said simply. "They see what they see, but that don't change what's real." Eliza smiled faintly. "I've learned something these plains teach you quickly. Life doesn't wait for permission. You can't beg for approval or live according to what others think you're worth. You can only move forward and tend the life you've been given." Thomas nodded, understanding that her words carried more than mere reflection. They were a philosophy forged in hardship. The frontier demanded strength and perseverance, and Eliza had survived in ways Dry Creek could not comprehend. Days turned into weeks, and Eliza settled into the rhythm of ranch life with a renewed sense of purpose. She taught herself the finer points of cattle herding, the patience required to mend fences under the scorching sun, and the care needed to manage the small herd of horses Thomas entrusted to her. Every task, no matter how menial, reinforced the lessons she had been learning since she left Dry Creek. Her worth was not contingent on anyone else's approval. One afternoon, as she tended the vegetable garden she had planted near the creek, she paused to rest. The soil beneath her nails and the sunlight warming her back reminded her of the cycles of life she had longed to participate in but had been denied. She pressed her hands over her belly and whispered softly, "We've made it this far, and we'll make it farther still." That night, the stars stretched endlessly across the prairie sky, and Eliza reflected on her journey. She had been cast out, judged, and misunderstood, yet the experience had not broken her. Instead, it had shaped her into someone stronger, someone capable of teaching and guiding others. She thought of the women in Dry Creek who would face similar judgments, and she felt a quiet determination to offer guidance and support whenever she could. Once she was able, education, she realized, was another form of redemption. Sharing knowledge about survival, about resilience, about the strength inherent in patience and courage, was a way to honor the child she carried and the life she had rebuilt. The West, harsh and unforgiving as it could be, rewarded those who learned, adapted, and persevered. Eliza leaned against the porch rail, feeling the rhythm of her unborn child moving within her. She knew the town would always remember her as the barren widow who left, but she no longer needed their acknowledgement. She had reclaimed her narrative, her identity, and her life. The future, wide and open as the plains themselves, awaited her with promise. She had learned that true redemption was not a gift from others, it was the result of courage, hard work, and the refusal to be defined by the limitations others placed upon you. And so, as the wind rustled the tall prairie grass, Eliza May Carter stood tall. The child she carried, the life she had rebuilt, and the freedom she had claimed, all were proof that she had turned exile into triumph. In that quiet, sunlit moment, she knew she was finally home. Educational note: life on the frontier often demanded independence, resourcefulness, and moral courage, particularly from women who faced harsh social judgments. Eliza's story illustrates resilience, self-worth, and the transformative power of claiming one's own path. Winter settled over the plains, softening the hard edges of the land with frost and quiet. Eliza May Carter stood at the edge of the pasture, her hands resting on the swell of her belly, now unmistakably round with new life. Snow drifted lightly across the fence posts, glinting in the early morning sun like a promise of renewal. She had survived exile, judgment, and fear, and now she carried the evidence of her endurance within her. Once a place of mere survival had become a home filled with warmth and possibility. Thomas Halle had been her steadfast companion, not because he was obligated, but because he understood the strength and dignity she carried. Together, they had tended the land, cared for the animals, and quietly built a family rooted not in expectation, but in love and respect. Eliza often thought of Dry Creek. The town had judged her harshly, labeling her barren and worthless. Yet she no longer carried anger for them, only clarity. Their opinions had never defined her, and now they mattered even less. She had learned that the frontier was both cruel and generous, cruel in its trials, generous in the freedom it allowed those brave enough to seize it. One crisp morning, as she prepared the garden beds for the coming spring, Thomas approached with a bundle swaddled in wool. Inside was a tiny, healthy child, born just days earlier under the wide, open sky. The child's cries echoed softly across the ranch, mingling with the wind and the low murmur of cattle. Eliza's heart swelled, and tears filled her eyes, not of sorrow, but of joy. Here was proof that life, even after hardship, could flourish. She held her child close, whispering the words she had once spoken to her empty belly. "They'll regret losing you, but we are ours to keep." Thomas knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand over hers. "You've given us life," he said, his voice steady and full of awe. "Not just this one, but the life we've built together. You've turned exile into hope." Over the months that followed, Eliza's ranch became a haven. Travelers and women who had faced rejection in other towns found refuge there, learning from Eliza the skills and resilience that had saved her. She taught them to tend gardens, care for animals, mend fences, and read the skies. She shared the lessons she had learned on the long trek from Dry Creek, that survival depended on courage, adaptability, and belief in oneself. Her child grew surrounded by love, not fear, by guidance, not judgment. The lessons of the frontier were woven into daily life: patience, resourcefulness, and the understanding that character mattered more than lineage or social approval. And as the child's laughter echoed across the plains, Eliza felt a profound sense of triumph. The town of Dry Creek faded in memory, a distant reminder of the cruelty that can accompany ignorance and rigid social expectations. Yet those lessons remained, not as scars, but as fuel for wisdom. Eliza understood that women like her and the children they nurtured had the power to reshape their destinies, even in a world that often sought to define them by what they lacked. On quiet nights, Eliza would sit on the porch with Thomas, the stars stretching endlessly above the plains. She would hold her child and reflect on the journey from rejection to reclamation. Every step, every hardship, every choice had led her to this moment, a life defined by love, autonomy, and resilience. The frontier had tested her, but it had also taught her that true strength was not in conforming to others' expectations, but in embracing one's own worth. Her life, once dismissed, had become a beacon for those willing to believe in themselves, regardless of society's judgment. And so, beneath the endless sky of the American West, Eliza May Carter looked out over the land she had claimed through perseverance, courage, and unwavering hope. With her child in her arms and Thomas by her side, she knew one thing for certain: they had survived, flourished, and created a future that no exile, judgment, or fear could ever take from them. The plains, wild and unyielding, had become home. And home, at last, meant freedom, love, and the enduring promise of hope. Educational note: frontier life demanded more than physical strength. It required resilience, resourcefulness, and moral courage. Eliza's story demonstrates how determination, skill, and self-belief could overcome social prejudice, offering a lasting lesson in empowerment and human dignity.